Good morning, Dr. Patmos here for you. Today it is April the 16th, and I have got what I think and hopefully you'll find an interesting video today. I have attached a link to an article which just appeared in the New England Journal that was a very interesting study, and it answers some very important questions. To tee this up, you have no doubt heard that the risk of vaccinating healthy children with the COVID mRNA vaccine is just not worth it because of the risk of myocarditis, and that we shouldn't be vaccinating healthy, low risk children. There's no such thing as no risk, it's just high risk versus low risk. You've no doubt heard this because it is exactly what Dr. Robert Malone has been saying all along. Dr. McCullough has been saying all along. Dr. Prasad echoed the same thoughts. Dr. Bhattacharya echoed the same thoughts. In fact, it's the core of his Great Barrington Declaration that low risk people, non seniors, children, young adults, should not be vaccinated because the risk of side effects is greater than the benefit. And so they all ran out and made that proclamation. In fact, that was what the CDC, ACIP under Malone recommended. And, first let me say it's not an inappropriate question to ask. What is the risk benefit ratio? Is the risk of vaccine associated myocarditis greater than the benefit? That's a very appropriate question to ask. What's inappropriate, though, is to jump to the conclusion that the risk benefit ratio is not favorable for low risk children. So therefore, don't vaccinate your children. Until you can't say that until you have good data. Well, now we have good data, and guess what? Look below, look at the article, look at the study. It was a very good study. It was a retrospective case comparison study in Brazil that looked at 7 million children over a 5 year period and compared the outcomes of children, excuse me, high risk children and low risk children who have had the primary series, 2 shots plus a booster. And then they compared the two groups, and the data is very interesting. They specifically looked at something called the number needed to vaccinate. That's kind of a offshoot of the number needed to treat. And it's a very important calculation. What the number needed to vaccinate tells you is that, now this study just looked at death, which, by the way, that is the primary purpose of a vaccination. Any vaccination is to prevent death. Preventing a mild illness is not the reason we vaccinate. We vaccinate to prevent death. So this study looked at exactly that. What is the number needed to treat to prevent a single death? And in high risk children, you only have to vaccinate 23 in order to save a life, in order to prevent one death. So the number needed to vaccinate is 23. That is a very impressive number. That means you only have to vaccinate 23 people. For every 23 people 23 children you vaccinate, you will save one life. That's a lot. So I don't think anybody in their right mind could, looking at a number needed to vaccinate at 23, could possibly say that you shouldn't vaccinate high risk children. I mean, that is, even the most anti-vaxxer should look at that data and say, well, you're going to save a life for every 23 you vaccinate. Certainly seems like a pretty good odds there. But so nobody, I don't think anybody in their right mind argues against vaccinating high risk children or high risk adults, not even Bhattacharya, who never even did a day of internship. But what about the low risk group of kids? This is the group of kids that Malone and McCullough and Bhattacharya, Prasad, and all the other anti-vaxxers have said staunchly, no, do not vaccinate young, low-risk children. The risk is too great. And they've won that. Because across the country, the vast majority of young, low-risk children are not vaccinated. So what is the number needed to treat for low-risk children? Well, it's certainly different. It's not 23, it's 2,000. So in other words, you need to vaccinate 2,000 low-risk kids to save one life. For every 2,000 children you vaccinate, you will prevent one death. There's a big difference between that and 23. And the authors of the study said, well, it kind of supports the risk-adjusted, decision about whether or not to treat. But let me point you to a little different perspective on this. A number needed to treat or a number needed to vaccinate of 2,000, when you scale that up to 1 million, what that means is that if you vaccinate 1 million low risk children, you will prevent 500 deaths. Is 500 deaths enough to prevent, to warrant justifying vaccinating 1 million children? Well, let's ask the question, what is the risk of myocarditis? There is this thing called vaccine associated myocarditis. It's now been pretty clearly established that there is some risk. We don't know exactly how it happens. We don't have a causality, but there is an association between the COVID mRNA vaccine and myocarditis in children. And that risk is 10 to 40 cases per million children vaccinated. And it's important to remember that the vast majority, nearly all of those cases of myocarditis, are mild and transient. There have been a handful around the world of, of fatal outcomes. Yes, there have been a few. There are none in the United States, but there have been a couple reported in, I think, Korea. And so it is recognized that there is a thing called vaccine-associated myocarditis, but it is very rare, 10 to 40 cases per million, and almost always mild and transient. So here's the comparison. Now you tell me what is the right thing to do. Do you vaccinate 1 million children to prevent 500 deaths or not? Because if you vaccinate 1 million children, you'll get between 10 and 40 cases of transient mild myocarditis. Almost always transient mild myocarditis. Maybe one or two of them, a very small number of them, are not transient and mild, and maybe or bad. What is the trade-off? Do you save 500 lives and put 10 to 40 kids at risk of something that often just goes away, or not? The authors of the study say this supports risk-based decision making. I don't know about you, but to me, preventing 500 deaths, there's no comparison. Per million doses of vaccine, you save 500 lives compared to 10 to 40 cases of transient mild. I'll take the save 500 lives. I come down on that side without question. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I think I have to wonder about your judgment if you think otherwise. Now, here's an important caveat. This did not look at other outcomes like serious critical illness that didn't kill you, that these kids end up on a ventilator in ICU for a month. It didn't look at long-term chronic disability, long COVID and other the disability that results from serious COVID. Didn't compare that. And obviously this study didn't look at transmission or mild, outpatient illness. Nobody cares about that anyway. The purpose of vaccination is to prevent death. The secondary purpose of vaccination is to prevent you from ending up in ICU on a ventilator for a month. So what this study looked at was the most important primary outcome, which is preventing death. And there's no question. In this study of 7 million children over a 5-year period, the COVID mRNA vaccine, 3 doses, had a number needed to vaccinate of 2,000. So per million kids vaccinated, you save 500 lives. Now here's the zinger. Here's the zinger here. To those doctors who've been arguing that children, and winning, that children should not be vaccinated, low-risk children should not be vaccinated, ponder that for every 1 million children vaccinated, you would have saved 500 lives. By not vaccinating children, you put 500 lives, you cost 500 lives. A couple of thousand kids in the United States have died of COVID. It's not, this disease did kill young, healthy children. And in fact, of adults, remember, I think about a third of all COVID deaths occurred in non-high risk populations. So there's no such thing as a no risk population. Everybody even healthy people are and have been at risk of dying from COVID, including children. It is true most of the deaths were in older and high risk people. There's clearly a thing with high risk comorbidities puts you at greater risk, but just being healthy doesn't mean you're at no risk. So the recommendations that have been made by McCullough, Malone, Bhattacharya, Prasad, and all the others, I think are mortally wrong. And I think there's no question that following their advice has put children at risk and led to unnecessary pediatric death. That's the number needed to vaccinate story. That's the data. As of this morning, that's where we stand. I reserve the right to change my opinion if there's new data that comes out tomorrow, which is what happens all the time in medicine. We always have to reevaluate our position because data is always changing and coming forward. That's the natural thing in medicine. Things don't stay the same, and having changing guidelines is not a criticism. That's the way science is. That's the way medicine works and has always worked. It's why you have to use up to date so you can be up to date every day. In any case, that's the story. You tell me, what do you think? Do you think a number needed to vaccinate of 2,000, uh, preventing 500 deaths per million vaccinations, do you think that number justifies the small risk of myocarditis? You tell me, what do you think? Or would you rather let 500 kids die?